My name is Maddie Baggett, and today I am joined with none other than rock and roll pioneer David Spero. David, I want to thank you so much for...
Oh, no problem. It's great to be here.
Oh, we all thank you. This is wonderful. All right, so you have a career that many rock and roll fans can only dream up. When did you first find music? How did you start to love it?
When I was 6 years old, I recorded a song with the Cleveland Orchestra called 67 Santas. And I did it at the old Cleveland recording where the James Gang and Grand Funk and all these other people made records. And it was like the coolest thing in the world to me that here I was, I got this orchestra behind me, And I just kind of fell in love with the process when I was 6. And by the time I was like 12, I was really listening to everything on the radio and knew that that's what I wanted to do. I was going to become a disc jockey. My dad had been a disc jockey in the 40s with Bill Randall and some of the guys that, first started rock and roll and all that. It just seemed like a really cool way to do things. So when I was in high school, in 10th grade, I was on a station called WXEN, which is 106 something now, And I did, it's kind of like your station, there was the Italian hour, and then there was the Polish hour, and then there was this hour. Well, I had midnight until I didn't want to be there anymore, as long as I was gone by 6 a.m. doing, underground radio. And I could play anything I wanted. And it was during the time that my dad was producing the Upbeat Show, which was a national rock and roll show out of Cleveland. So I'd bring, Jimmy Page over to do my radio show, because if he'd been on the show with the Yardbirds that day, or, I'd bring over whoever I thought would be cool to bring over, and they'd come over to the station and, we'd just have a night of it, and it was, it really got into my blood. And then a station called WNCR, which was really the first of the, real underground station 24/7 started. And my dad had some contacts, and I went over there and I pretended like I really knew what I was doing. I'd never run a board or anything out at the other station. They had a guy running the board. And they said, cool, you're the morning guy, you start Monday. It was like I spent the whole weekend there watching everybody work, trying to figure out what all these dials were,
And you were really young, right? When did you first...
17.
Oh, wow. Did you ever feel pressure to... No?
I mean, it was not a job. It was like, that's like I'm going to play music, and talking was no big deal. I was just going to, it just came natural. And then we did WNCR for a year, and me and a guy named Billy Bass and Martin Crow, we all left NCR on Friday, and we started WNS on Monday. And that was the real deal. Oh, that was the real deal with radio.
Through radio, you've interviewed these phenomenal, just historical artists. Do you have a favorite interview you did?
Wow. Well, the first interview I ever did was with Janis Joplin. And hey, I can't even tell the story. Because I thought...
Because things happened.
Because things had happened.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, wow, I'm liking this job, And yeah, I think one of my favorite interviews was not necessarily with the biggest star that I've ever interviewed. It was a guy named Nicky Hopkins. Nicky was a keyboard player, and he was a session guy in the UK, and he played on all the records of The Who and the Kinks and Donovan, and then was the keyboard player for the Rolling Stones on tour for a long time, played in the Jefferson Airplane, the Jefferson Starship. He was on something like 400 or 500 records that charted, which is amazing. So talking to him, and I was, I did it as a favor for a guy at Columbia Records, because he had finally had his own solo out. And we became really good friends. He did 4 hours on my show. If I had a longer show, he would have stayed on. We were just playing all the stuff that he played on, and it's like, really? And, he'd say, oh, yeah, well, I did this thing here, and, he'd talk about what the producer had asked for or whatever. It just opened my mind to what the studio possibilities were. And I ended up managing him years on and, dealing with the Stones for them. And he played in Stevie Nicks' band, and it was kind of fun. He was a wonderful man.
So let's switch up. You just mentioned managing. So let's switch from radio to managing. When did you decide to make that switch?
I never did. I didn't. Joe Walsh, who I've known since I was about 13 years old, he used to hang out at the radio station with me because he loves radio. Like, he picks songs, and they'd let him read the news and stuff. He said that he was working on this record with this guy from Cleveland named Michael Stanley. He was playing guitar and helping him write, and he was using his band to back up Michael. And he said, you need to manage this guy so that eventually you'll become my manager. And I said, well, I don't know anything about managing. He goes, well, no, I'm going to bring you out to L.A. You're going to follow my manager around, a guy named Ruby Natesoff. And I followed him for about 6 or 7 months. And he taught me 2 things: everything I needed to know and everything I didn't want to be, which was kind of a good thing, because I didn't really have this vision of me being out in L.A. with, every shark in the world. And I figured, well, if I can do this out of Cleveland, I'll just kind of own it, So that's what I did. And I had Michael, and he had introduced me to a guy named Bill Simzik, who's that producer who you see on the back of all those albums of the Eagles and the Who and Seeger and Walsh and Stanley and all those guys that he produced. He doesn't have a vowel in his name. And so I was managing him as well as Michael. And there was a guy from Lorraine who had just started on this show called Saturday Night Live. And he had a character called Father Guido Sarducci.
Okay.
His name's Don Novello. He's from Lorraine. So I had this little stable already of these 3 guys. And, everybody had a major label. We're all with major labels and major touring companies. And Michael's opening for Aerosmith, and he's opening for the Eagles, and he's opening for so many different Loggins and Messina. We used to tour 250 dates a year. So I did that up until the late 70s. And then I just got burnt out. The problem with rock and roll at that period was cocaine was really not illegal as a drug. I don't remember what year that all changed, but it wasn't. It was legal if you had a prescription, and, of course, in rock and roll, you can get anything you want. And, drugs and alcohol started to play into it, and I was in a really bad cycle. And I wasn't doing a good job, and I was pretty sure I was going to die, and, oh well, I was here, And I just had a weird incident one day that I left my car running at a red light and got out to go talk to a friend of mine. Forgot the car was there, left. Next morning, I think my car's stolen. Call the police. They said, oh no, we found it. The keys were in it. It was running. I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have left keys in my car. Said somebody must have taken it and found the keys. It made up this whole thing and said, that's it. And so now I'm like 36 years clean and sober. But realized I couldn't go back to what I was doing because it was so easy. You shake hands with the promoter and there's, 2 grams sitting there in your hand. And somehow just through, I've had this life where things just like, oh, what's that in my lap? Oh, I ended up working for Columbia Pictures for like 13 years. And worked on pictures like Ghostbusters and Karate Kid and Gandhi and Tootsie and all these. I mean, it was during their heyday. And so I just kept doing that. And then one day while I was doing that, I got the call from Walsh. And he said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "For what?" And he goes, "I told you I was going to call you." And I said, "Seriously?" So I quit Columbia Pictures that day and went out to California, hung with Joe for an hour, and next thing I knew, I was his manager, and he needed a tour to start in 3 months, and he was just finishing the record, and I'm like, "Oh, you..." And now you've hit the big time.
Joe Walsh, a phenomenal performer, breathtaking. What is your favorite? Do you have a favorite song to watch him perform?
I think Life's Been Good. And for two reasons. One, I remember when he was writing the song. And most people think it's a funny song. And it really is a very, very sad song. I mean, it's about this guy that has everything but doesn't have a second to enjoy it. You know, he's pulled into parties and dropped off in his room, and he's got this mansion he's never seen, and he's got accountants paying all the bills. He doesn't even know what the bills are. And, you know, it was a reality check song for him. And I see, when he performs that, I see the Joe that wrote that song and knowing where he was at the time, even though, you know, inside every clown is a very sad person, and he's that person.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Joe Walsh is a free spirit. Did you ever find it difficult to manage somebody like that?
24/7. Before Joe got sober, which was in the early 90s, if my phone rang at night, I was afraid it was that call. Because, you know, he lived on the edge. You know, that's where he was the most comfortable, and tilting over, like, towards the ground. That's where he lived. And, yeah, it was tough, but you know what? As most musicians, it all came down to the music. And I would notice that as tours would end, and we did lots of tours together. And I did tours that Joe was on where, like, Michael Stanley Band opened, and I would see the same Joe. The further into the tour it got, the closer to the end, the more volatile he would get. And it hit me one time. We were doing the Joe Walsh and Glenn Frey tour right before everything happened with the Eagles again. And we had finished the tour. We were on Long Island. And that night, Joe had, like, really destroyed his dressing room. Nothing was right, screaming at everybody. And it was the last night of the tour. And the next morning, I'm getting ready to leave, and he's leaving, and we're in the lobby. And I saw this guy that wasn't a rock star. He wasn't a guitar player. He was a lost guy. And everybody's there with their families, you know. All the families usually come to the last show, you know. And Joe was there by himself. And I thought, he's got nowhere to go. As he gets closer and closer to nowhere to go, so he starts freaking out.
As a manager and a friend, what was that like for you?
Once I figured it out, it made a whole lot more sense. And I knew I needed to keep him busy when he wasn't working. So that's what I got him involved in, like, getting on the Drew Carey show, where he was a semi-regular for a couple seasons, or he had done a couple other TV shows. I got some film properties that he was looking at, or, you know, something he could do soundtrack work for. All of a sudden, it just changed everything.
So that whole lifestyle and working with somebody like Joe Walsh could be very judgmental. Why did you stick around? You could have just walked.
Because you're there. There's something, and it's something I'll never forget. Eagles were playing Rose Bowl, We had 107, 108,000 people in there. And as we always, everybody always walked to the stage together. Okay. And, we're walking up, and we've been on this tour for a year and a half already. So, not really a big deal. But as we get closer and closer, the audience was so loud. And all it was when the stage went dark. And they're out of control. And Joe stops. And he said, "Some of that's for you, And, not that I didn't know that, but to hear it,
Yeah.
that's why you stick around. It isn't for the 22 hours that you're working your ass off or sitting in a hotel room or traveling. It's for those 2 hours or 3 in the case of Eagles, That's what it's for. It's just, boy, watching everybody at the top of their game, just kicking ass. That's what it's about. And whether it was, with the Dickie Betts from the Allman Brothers or Richie Furay from Buffalo Springfield, I've been so fortunate that these guys have, come into my life in certain ways that I've worked with all of these Hall of Famers and legends, so it's kind of, I'm the luckiest guy in the world, the way these things have happened, like with Dickie Betts. I never met Dickie in my life. And I was working at the Rock Hall, and I was leaving the Rock Hall. I decided to go back into management. I just kind of got bored. I was in one place for the whole long time. I was producing a TV show called Live at the Rock Hall for MTV, which I really enjoyed doing, but then it stopped. And then it was like, I don't only need to be here anymore, And so I put together a goodbye party for myself that was a fundraiser for the Rock Hall. I had Peter Frampton, and I called up like some of my good friends and said, "Hey, come on, do this for me."
Yeah.
It's a fundraiser for the Rock Hall. And we were supposed to have Greg Allman, and Greg got sick, and Dickie showed up. And Dickie knew who I was from other people that we both knew. And he said, "Well, I'm looking for a manager." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Why don't you come and see me next week when you're done here, and we'll get together." Well, we've been working for 14 years together now. Cat Stevens, who goes by Yusuf right now, I had known in the early 70s when I was a disc jockey, played his music. And I was doing a DVD with Dickie Betts that we actually shot at the Rock Hall. And I was calling the president of the company that was doing the DVD. And unbeknownst to me, when the secretary says, David Spero, line 3, Cat is in this guy's office, and he says, "David Spero from Cleveland?" Now, Cat had left the business for 31 years. Nobody heard a word from him. I never knew he was back in business. And next thing I know, he'd gotten my phone number from this guy. I'm at home, and he calls, goes, "Dave, yeah." Says, "Yusuf, you need me as Cat Stevens." And I said, "Oh my God." I thought you were like gone or something. Yeah, I was. Well, I wasn't, but I was. And the next afternoon I flew to New York, and next thing I know, I'm his manager. Right? These circles, I've just lived this life of circles. I don't know how to explain it.
Was there any moment in this life of circles where you took a step back and you said to yourself, "This is it, I've made it"? Or are you just constantly riding that circle?
That's interesting. I'm afraid to do that. I'm in the midst of writing a book.
Okay.
Michael Heaton, who writes for The Plain Dealer and has written other people's books, came to me and said, "I think it's time you've got all these stories. We should get them down." So we are. And I think when I read that book, I'll look at that and go, "Wow, that guy did okay." It still never seems to be me. There's a record I did with Yusuf, I don't know, a year and a half ago. We were doing part of it down in Nashville, and he just finished something. He said, you know who would be perfect to do the harmony on this? And I said, who? He said, Paul McCartney. I said, well, do you know him? He goes, no, I met him on stage once in like 1971. We sang All You Need Is Love together from opposite side of the stage, and we did this. He said, that's about the closest I ever got to. I said, well, you know, I dealt with him through the Rock Hall on a couple of things, and I'd met him and knew him from Upbeat days, but he wouldn't know who I was to, save anything. And so I called his office and I said, look, Yusuf is looking to see if Paul would be interested in doing this with him. And I left Yusuf's cell phone number and I said, listen, if he's going to call him, please call me first and let me know. And here's my number. So it's 5:00 in the morning down in Nashville. My phone rings. I look, it says, private or something. And it's like, I never answer those. Then I start thinking, well, I'm out of town where somebody's in the hospital.
Yeah.
So I answer and I hear a voice go, Yusuf? I said, no, it's David. Oh, Dave, it's Paul McCartney. I get to sing with him, eh? And I'm like, excuse me, comb my hair, mouthwash. And I said, I thought you were going to be calling him, I didn't even know he was. He said, well, I thought this was, I got the numbers mixed up and all this because they were both U.S. numbers. And he says, well, when does he want to do it? And I said, well, it's kind of up to your schedule. He said, well, when do you guys go back to the UK? I said, Wednesday. And he said, I get back Tuesday night. How about Thursday, 11 a.m.? And there's a studio, he tells me the studio, it's right down the street from his office. Meet you there. Let's call it 11. Okay. No. Am I sleeping still? Yeah. And so I said, do me a favor, please call Yusuf, call the other number, tell him direct. Even though it's 5:00 in work. So I'm just waiting, and about 5 minutes go by, and there's a knock on my door, and there's Yusuf in his bathrobe, and he's like, you never guess who called. And I said, oh, mute, I just hit this stream, but Paul McCartney calls you, and he said to be at the studio at 11 next Thursday. He goes, oh my God, that's what just happened. I had to tell him the truth. He's a little closer out there than I am. So I'm like, yeah, I called here too. So next thing I know, not even a week later, I'm in the studio with Paul McCartney and I'm saying, blah, blah, blah. And this is kind of what we're looking for because Yusuf is just so intimidated by him. He's like, even though Paul did everything he could to make everybody feel at easy, he walked in and he had an acoustic guitar and Yusuf said to him, is that the guitar? Is that the old Martin you used to use or is that the reissue? And Paul says, oh, this one? No. This one did, I've just seen a face I can't forget. I'm all play. And next thing he's saying to Yusuf, well, on Moonshadow, you've got that weird key change. Show that to me. And the two of them are going back and forth for about 45 minutes playing their songs. It's me and the engineer. And we're just sitting there going. And I managed to take some pictures. I don't know why I didn't think to just set the camera down and record it. I'm so stupid sometimes. And I don't like to intrude. But yeah. And then when Paul's in the studio, I called my older brother and I said, I think I'm in London. And I think I'm in the studio with Paul McCartney. And what the hell am I doing here? I am so out of my league, I thought. And my brother says, but you're in the studio with Cat Stevens, too. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that's pretty cool.
Was it Abbey Road Studios?
No, we did it. I've worked at Abbey Road. Yusuf did some stuff there. We did the Live from Abbey Road TV show, which was kind of cool. And first time I was at Abbey Road, an engineer was showing me around it. And we were sitting in the studio in a control room, and all of a sudden it was like, went ice cold and was really shaky. And I said, and the guy looked at me and says, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I don't know. I don't feel well. He says, well, that's right where Paul was sitting when he did Bluebird on that couch where you're sitting right now. And I said, this is it? He goes, Yeah, you can feel it. And I did. I didn't even know. It just freaked me out.
Oh, wow. So between everything you've done, you've gained a lot of artifacts, and your house has been quoted as being a mini Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Do you have a favorite artifact, one that stands out amongst the others?
Yeah. I've got a guitar that Paul signed for me that is hanging on the wall with a frame that has 3 pictures as he's signing it. And you can see he wrote rock and roll is here to stay, Paul McCartney. So you see in the first picture, rock and rock, and, is here to stay. And then the last one finally shows up with the signature, and then there's the guitar sitting right there. But I also have a drum head, a Beatle drum head that Ringo made. That's on one of the 1964 bass drums. Wasn't his, but he gave it to me. The drum was it's like just one that he had. It wasn't like an actual one to use, but the drum head was from the second Ed Sullivan show. And then I also have the original. It's the first print that Cat Stevens did of Tea for the Tillerman, because he drew that cover. And then back in the radio days, he had given me that. And those things, I mean, I have a lot of gold and platinum records that, were like, well, I don't deserve those. I didn't record those records. I mean, it's fun. I was a part of them in lots of ways. My favorite of those probably is Ziggy Stardust, because at MMS we were the first station in kind of the world to expose David Bowie to people. So David had given me a gold record for that. So
through everything, through all of your stories, through everything you've experienced, how are you able to stay so humble?
Because none of it's about me. It's like I have a good phone book, but it isn't. None of it's, I can't say, oh, well, this is me, this is me, this is me, this is me. It's, I've just been really fortunate to, be with my heroes. Music was all that mattered to me growing up. I worked on the 1974 Four-Way Street, became Four-Way Street after fact, but the CSNY tour. And I was going to my room one night, and, we stayed pretty high in that tour. And I was walking past Neil's room, and he used to have the Spender Rhodes piano in his room. The door was kind of open, and he was playing something from after the Gold Rush. I just kind of kicked the door open. I said, that album got me through my junior year in high school. Knowing I could go home and listen to that for hours, it got me through. And he's like, oh, sit on the bat, Dave, And we're both sitting there, still of our minds, singing, Southern Man, when... I mean, it's crazy that I've gotten to live these moments. There's so many times it's like, where's that camera? Why isn't that camera following me, But I've had these artists, Cat Stevens sit in my living room and play Tea for the Tillerman, the whole album, on his guitar, trying to remember if he can do all the songs off of it. And just, try and do everything I can not to start crying, Because to me, that was such a pivotal album in my life. And I don't know, maybe it's like, Tom Hanks' character, he's the tennis player in China, and he hanging with presidents, and he's like living this life that the camera actually followed him on. But why can't I think of the name? Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
Yeah, or Zelig with Woody Allen. I'm actually living that life. I don't know why. I don't understand it. I don't think I could do anything else. I wouldn't know what to do. I never went to college. I never finished high school. I was my senior year. I'm the morning guy on WMMS. It's like, well, why did I need to stay in school? I knew what I wanted to do. I regret that to this day. I would have liked to at least had the college experience. I kind of got it being on tour and being on so many college campuses, with bands. But yeah, I've missed a lot of that stuff. It's a regret.
So I have one more question for you. Is there any moment that you can just look back and is that a career highlight? Do you have a career highlight?
Well, being in the studio with McCartney, that to me was as many times as my brother and I sat in our bedrooms with our hair combed down over our foreheads, singing Beatles songs at the top of our lungs. I don't know what could top that. I was involved when Buffalo Springfield reformed a couple of years ago with Richie Furay and Neil Young and Stephen Stills, and here we are at Bonnaroo in front of 97,000 people, and I'm staring on the stage looking out there. I mean, that was amazing. Doing the Hell Freezes Over tour, doing Ringo Starr tours. I remember I was walking down a street in New York once with a friend of mine. We're just walking and Ringo's coming towards us. And I'm thinking, I know him. I know he knows me, but this is like real life now. And he goes, "Hey Dave, what are you doing?" And my friend is like, "Oh my God, he really knows you." And it's like, in the end, they're all just people, and they all have heartache, and they all have great times, and they go back to their family lives, those that have families, and go to the grocery store and cut their lawn, and probably Paul McCartney, but everybody else, To me, there's like Paul, everybody else, and it's always been that way.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people like that with Neil Young, but I've known Neil for so long, it's kind of hard. And even with like Eagles or the Zeppelin guys, they all knew really well before they hit. And it's hard to look and think, wow, they're really something. But it isn't. It's just Joe and Glenn and Don and Timothy. It's band. It's like, these are legends and icons to a lot of people and to me, but they're also my friends.
Yeah.
They're people that I get Christmas cards from and send Christmas cards to. They're, part of their families and go to the important birthdays and things like that. It's, I don't know. I don't live in reality, so it's hard for me to really give you an answer to that.
Wonderful. Well, David, I want to thank you so much for stopping by. All of your stories were fantastic. And
It'll make a good book out there.
I can't wait for that release. You said October?
Hopefully, yeah.
We'll see. We're all waiting anxiously for that.
When reading this, I must be dead.
Yes. Oh, okay. Real quick. Tell us the story about how you got that name.
On the Eagles tour, on Hell Freezes Over, everybody had to sign a non-disclaimer, except for me, because I did work for the Eagles. I was Joe Walsh's manager. So throughout the whole tour, Henley and Fry, they don't get along much. Glenn would call me up or come to my room and he would say, "Oh, Henley did today." And I'd be writing all this stuff down, kept a diary. And then one night we were flying from Pittsburgh to Las Vegas. We're going to open up the Hard Rock Hotel out there. You gave us way too much money to play for like 35 cents. It was ridiculous. And we had our own plane and we're flying out there. And Glenn comes over to me and he says, "I got it." And I'm like, "Well, what? The title for your book. What is it?" And he hands me his little piece of paper and says, "If you're reading this, I must be dead." There he is.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all. I was waiting for that. For Matt, for CO420, I'm Maddie Baggett. Thank you.
Very